The poem we're covering in this tutorial is The Wind Begun to Rock the Grass by Emily Dickinson. This poem is great because it's just a poem about a storm. Simple as that. But of course, you know that whenever a poem is simple in content, then it's the structure that is going to be important. So we're going to spend a lot more time looking at the structure of this poem and how effective it is in talking about something as simple as a storm. There's a couple of notable aspects of the poem that we will go through in terms of structure. The first is the use of personification throughout the poem. The storm is personified and various aspects of nature are personified, sometimes not entirely. So sometimes they're not described as a person per se, but as just a part of a person. The second thing that's interesting about the poem is the use of punctuation. Emily Dickinson uses dashes a lot. We'll talk about the dashes because some versions of the poem don't have as many of them, but she uses dashes almost to create a kind of an ongoing pace and doesn't have a lot of other punctuation. So that's a notable thing. And then the final thing, I'm just putting it in here because, oh my God, I found out about it while I was researching and I've never heard of it and I'm sure you haven't ever. And that's a poetic device called hendiades, which you can look at that word and then never think about it again, but you don't often encounter it in poetry. So I'm putting it in here for those of you that are interested in learning a poetic device that you hadn't encountered before. I definitely do not think that you need to know this for the exam, but oh my gosh, if you remember it and you chuck it out there, if it comes up in the exam, you have to score points. I mean, you have to, come on. But before we carry on with the poem, I want you to just pause a little bit and just think about storms. Now, you're super lucky because if you are living in Joburg, then you know all about storms. So just think a little bit about the way that storms happen. You know, it starts with the light getting a little bit darker. You notice it. You maybe see the clouds building up because you notice that change in the light. It's still warm. You might feel the occasional little gust and you know that a storm is coming. You might be sitting somewhere and you look out the window and you feel it. You might be outside. But you know it's quite far away, but it's coming. You know that the storm is on its way. And then you start to feel those first cool gusts blowing things around. Then those first few drops that hit and they create that lovely smell, which is called petrichor, if you don't know about it. Those first big plops of rain on the hot ground, the paving or the tar or wherever it is that you are. And then you've got that deluge that follows, the wind, the rain, you run around to get everything out of cover, and then it passes, and then it's calm again. So just you know storms. Just keep that idea of storms in your mind as you read this, because this is a poem about a storm, and so that's something that you are no doubt quite familiar with. So I'm going to do a verse by verse analysis of this poem so that we can unpack the structure and the notable aspects of the structure. The wind begun to rock the grass with threatening tunes and low. He flung a menace at the earth, a menace at the sky. The leaves unhooked themselves from trees and started all abroad. The dust did scoop itself like hands and throw away the road. The wagons quickened on the streets, the thunder hurried slow. The lightning showed a yellow beak and then a livid claw. The birds put up the bars to nests, the cattle fled to barns. There came one drop of giant rain, and then, as if the hands that held the dams had parted, hold, the waters wrecked the sky, but overlooked my father's house, just quartering a tree. Okay, there might be some parts of that seem a little strange to you, but by the end of this, you're going to understand all of them. So let's just go through it verse by verse so that you get a full understanding of it. So let's start with the first verse. Now, you might have noticed that word begun, and you might have thought that was a ridiculous error, or maybe it was some kind of old-fashioned English, but it's not. It's deliberately incorrect, and Dickinson has put that in there deliberately. The wind begun to rock the grass. She does that because she deliberately wants to create a sense of unease. She wants the reader to feel uncomfortable and off balance. Incidentally, I might refer to this as we go through the analysis, but there are actually two versions of this poem. And so there is some disagreement about some word choice and also some punctuation. So it is possible that if you get this in an assessment, you might get a version that is slightly different from one that you have studied. Don't freak out and don't think that there's some kind of error. It is definitely possible that you would have got one of the, one version or the other version. In one of the versions, Dickinson has used the word need. She said the wind began to knead the grass. So it's interesting that she uses different words. But what I want you to remember about this, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is her word choice. The wind rocks the grass. Now think about rocking. Who rocks things, and why would you rock something? You rock something to sleep, or you rock it to calm it down, don't you? And yet, we've got a lot of threatening, menacing kinds of words here. Now, just for the hell of it, here is that weird poetic device, Hendiades. This use of the threatening tunes and low. She could have said with threatening and low tunes, not so. So what is that threatening tunes and low? That also is calculated to create a kind of an ambiguity. The tunes are threatening, that's definite, because the threatening is the adjective and the noun are the tunes. And then one of the other adjectives is added with this and. That's what Hendiades is. It's a figure of speech in which and is used in an odd kind of way to join two words together. I've given you an explanation of it there. You can go and look at the slideshow later in your own time if you want to read through that. I'm not going to go through it in this particular presentation, but I'm just putting it in there for interest's sake. What I want you to take from this is not so much what the figure of speech is or an understanding of the figure of speech, but how that figure of speech also makes things a little bit unbalanced with threatening tunes and low. It's an unusual structure, it's an unusual sentence structure, and it's done deliberately. Take a look at some of the words there: threatening, flung, menace. Those are all kind of words with some negative connotation. And the other thing that I want you to look at is who might be the he over here. Is he God or is he the storm? If it's the storm, it's definitely been personified. We can't be sure whether it's God because the fact that he is capitalized could be a function of its place in the sentence. It's at the beginning of the sentence and not necessarily the capitalization of he. So even that is a little bit ambiguous. And then, as I said, just note the diction in here, the connotations of those words like threatening, flung, menace. Those are not positive connotations. But they're contrasted with this idea that the wind is rocking the grass, which is actually quite a calm action. So there's some contrast in there. Don't worry, you'll see that it all amounts to something at the end of the poem. More personification here. The leaves unhook themselves from the trees, and the leaves start all abroad. The dust scoops itself like hands and throws away the road. The wind. What's happening in this particular figure of speech is that the wind has picked up all of the dust as if it was like hands scooping the dust up and throwing it up into the air, and it's done it so that you can't even see the road anymore. It's thrown it almost as if it's thrown away the road. Abroad in this context means in all different directions. So the leaves are blowing in all different directions. Just look at the personification there. The leaves unhook themselves. That's an action. They don't just fall off the trees. They kind of deliberately unhook themselves from the trees. And the hands are, the dust is like hands. That's that partial personification that I was talking to you about. Just one aspect of a person referred to. The wagons quickened on the streets, the thunder hurried slow, and lightning showed a yellow beak and then a livid claw. Now, hurried slow, you should immediately be able to identify as an oxymoron. You can't hurry and be slow at the same time. So I hope that you picked that up. If you didn't, there it is. Don't forget it. It's an oxymoron in that the thunder is hurrying and yet it's slow. But it's quite an effective one, because if you think about it, thunder always kind of comes after the rest of the storm. You get the lightning, you get the rain, and then you get the thunder a little while later. But there's also this idea that the thunder sort of arrives in its own time. Now, you could, if you wanted to, interpret that also as quite threatening. Think about those sorts of horror films when the bad person is kind of advancing on somebody, and they don't, when they do it slowly, it's almost more scary than when they come fast. So there's also an idea of kind of threat and sort of a kind of a scariness in that. And then the lightning here also is a kind of personification. It's referred to parts of a bird, the yellow beak, the flash, and then a claw. Interestingly, the lightning doesn't actually do anything. So if you look at the previous stanzas where the storm is doing something, it's throwing up the dust, it's whirling the trees around, it's rocking the grass, the lightning just reveals itself and then disappears again. The lightning showed a yellow beak and then a livid claw, and that's all that we see of the lightning. Livid, by the way, has two meanings. One is a kind of a bluish grey color, almost the color of a bruise, and the other is really angry, furious. You're livid. If you're livid with something, you're really, really cross. So either of those two meanings could be used here, and either of the two of them has connotations that match the intention of the poem, if you think about it. And here's the last two stanzas, which are interesting in a number of respects. So the first two lines here are nothing special. The birds put up the bars to nests, the cattle fled to barns. That just tells you that the animals are all seeking shelter. The birds put up the bars to nests. It's almost like they protect themselves in their nests, and the cattle flee to the barns. And then the rain arrives, one big drop. And then you've got a complete change of pace. Because look at those first three lines. The birds put up the bars to nests, the cattle fled to barns, there came one drop of giant rain, and then the pace changes. And then, as if the hands that held the dams had parted hold, the waters wrecked the sky. So what you've got here is this image of hands holding the dams of water as if they're holding it all together, and then the hands just release. They open up, they part. And the water wrecks the sky. There's so much water that it's a deluge, and it destroys the sky. You know, when it rains so hard that you can't see the difference between the earth and the sky, that's what is being described here. The floodgates open. So there's that one little drop of rain and then a downpour. And it just, not only does it obliterate the land, but it obliterates the sky too. It takes away the difference between the land and the sky. Incidentally, just a fun fact here is the fact that in one of the other versions of the poem, it said that the cattle clung to barns, not that they fled to barns, which is also, just a slightly different word choice there. Not something that you need to remember. And then we have the last two lines, which are quite interesting because the poem just ends. It ends on a dash, and it ends with the storm sparing her father's house. So you've got all this chaos. You've got the wind, the dust, the rain, the deluge, and then it overlooked my father's house. Now that's also a form of personification, by the way, because the storm seems to have some sort of sentience there. The storm overlooked my father's house. It didn't focus on her father's house. What it did do is it completely destroyed a tree just nearby. It quarters the tree. So it split the tree into four, but overlooks her father's house. And then you end with that dash, just quartering a tree. And then what? It's almost like we just end in the middle of the description, which of course is also deliberate, because what you've got here is you've got a sort of a snapshot of that storm. This is all of the things that it did. And then it just overlooked my father's house. It destroyed the tree. It's almost as if she's going to carry on, but she doesn't. And that's part of what makes the poem interesting, is that it's a snapshot of that part of the storm at that particular point in time. So now what I'm going to do is just look at 3 specific aspects of it so that you can see the poem as a whole. The first is the personification that's contained in the poem. Now, there's all the way through, there's the storm is personified in various ways. The wind rocks the grass. There's a he that could be referring to the storm. You've got those leaves that are unhooking themselves, and you've got the hands scooping up the dust. You've also got the hands later on holding the water. All of that is quite effective because we see that the storm is a kind of an agent of action. It is having an effect on the environment. And then in stanza 5, you have the interesting idea that the storm almost seems to have kind of passed by the house deliberately, in that idea of it overlooking the house. There's almost a suggestion there that there's a sentience in the storm. Is this reference to something supernatural or something spiritual? It isn't specifically stated in the poem. It's left up to us to decide, but it's there nevertheless. The second thing that we are going to look at is the punctuation. So let's look at some specific references to punctuation. In the first 3 stanzas, what's interesting is that those are the stanzas that describe the approach of the storm. And if you go back and look at them, what I suggest you do when you are listening to these tutorials is that you actually have the poem in front of you. So if you were to look at the poem, you would see that each of the first 2 stanzas are 1 sentence each. They end on a full stop, and they each describe the approach of the storm. 4 and 5 are a little bit different because what they do is that they show what happens when the storm arrives. They're all 1 sentence, and the only thing that they're punctuated by are the dashes, and they don't even really end. They form 1 single continuous thought. And the punctuation there is what the dashes do is that they create a series of transitions from one image to another. It's like flashing on that and then flashing on the next thing. And the final line even ends in that dash, that kind of unfinished thing. So it's almost like a montage of images that's being created by these different descriptions of the storm that she is conjuring up. You'll notice, I'm not sure whether it's necessary to note, but the only pieces of punctuation apart from the full stops at the end of the sentences and the dashes are a semicolon in line 6 and a comma in line 15. They're sort of like deliberate pauses at those particular points. So it might be worth taking a look at that, because you know that whenever there's punctuation being used that deliberately, and whenever that particular pause takes place, maybe it's done deliberately, and take a look and see whether you can figure out why it's done that way. You can speculate about it. There isn't any particular answer. It will be like any other description of punctuation, a correlation between the thing that is being described and the use of the punctuation relative to that thing. So in a storm, there's those brief pauses, or those seeming pauses, those brief periods of calm. You know that phrase, the calm before the storm. So it might be something relating to that. And then the last thing that I want to look at is the diction in the poem. You've already seen that there's some interesting use of words in some parts of the poem. So let's look at a couple of interesting words. The first things that we have is that we've got words that describe the action of the poem. The action of the storm. Like, what is the storm actually doing? The storm menaces, it's threatening. There's reference to like livid and wrecked and flung. These are words that quite clearly have negative connotations to them. But you've also got words that are completely neutral. So when the leaves unhook themselves, when the hands scoop up the dust, the holding, all of that sort of thing, those are just neutral terms. So although some aspects of the storm are quite menacing, they're balanced out by some other things that are completely neutral. And what you ultimately have in this poem, and this probably will take us to what I think the theme of the poem is that the poem describes the changes that the storm brings about. The storm transforms the landscape in some way. Look at what it does. It blows the leaves around, it kneads the grass, it wrecks the sky. There's all of the things that the storm transforms. But there's one point that isn't affected. Her father's house stays the same. So you have a contrast between the transformation created by the storm and the stability of one point. Transformation versus stability. The transformation of the natural world versus the stability of the domestic environment. Now, the reason why I mention that is because that's actually a common theme in a lot of Emily Dickinson's poems. So although we aren't studying Emily Dickinson herself, that's quite a recurring theme, and it's something that you can refer to when you are interpreting this poem, when you're looking at an understanding of this poem. You might think that the storm itself is negative and that's bad, but it isn't entirely bad, in the same sense that the transformation that happens here doesn't sort of end in any kind of actual destruction. There are points of calm in it, and it's not that bad. And so that's probably what the theme of the poem is here, is this idea of natural transformation contrasted with domestic stability. And that, in a nutshell, is this poem, The Wind Begun to Rock the Grass.